Welcome everyone. Now I believe you have already done the first part of backend, which is create canvas and update the canvas cell with colors. Now I'm gonna walk you through how to store historical data for the canvas cell's color whenever it's changed. So now the idea is we want to create a time lapse for the canvas to see that how the canvas has been changed during the whole time. And in order to do that, we will store the data just like this one. So one of the item cells has been changed from the white color to another color at this time. We will grab all of this information and put it into the historical data. So basically the idea is inside the canvas controller, we have the update cells method. Inside of that method, we call the save changes async. So the idea is to wrap around this method. So what we will do is whenever this method is called, we will grab all needed data, which is the old value and the new values that it will be changed to, and save all of that into the historical data table. And then we will save the latest data into the current color data table. So to be clear, after this step, we will have three tables in our database. One is the canvas table, which will store the latest version of the canvas. The color data table, which will store the latest value of the data cells. And also we will also create one more table, which is the historical data table, which store all the historical data of the color cells. So you can see here we have the historical data stores all the changes of the cells from canvas. We have the old value, the new value has been changed to, and then we also know which color cell is that and the time of change. Okay, so let's do it. So firstly, in the folder models, we will need to create a new class named historicaldata.cs. And inside the historicaldata.cs, we will define all the columns. So this will be the table historical data that will store all the values that are needed. So just for your information, because I'm redoing this process, so that's why I have this historical data table here. For you, you will not have it in the beginning. So now we will create the same thing of this one. So in this file of historical data in the models folder, we will define the table name, which is also the name of the file, and all the columns that are needed. We will have the ID of each change here, the table name, which is the name of the table the change has occurred. In our case, we only have the table color data here. And then the date time that the change has occurred. So the key values here is the color data ID. It will depend on what is changing. As I say, when we wrap around this method, whenever this method is called, the color data is changed. So that's why the table name is the color data and this one is the color data ID. So like if we have another method to change another table, then the key value will be different. In this case, basically it will just only be the color data ID. And here the old values is the old color that the cells was, and the new values is the color that the cells will be changed to. So after that, in the application database.cs, which is our context, we will need to have the getter and setter here for the historical data that we have just created. And one of the important thing here for the key, the ID, is we want it to be automatically generated whenever a new item is created, which is whenever one row is created, we will have the ID to be automatically generated. So we will have this line to execute that. And also for the migration to recognize that in the application database.cs, we also need to override the onModel grading for it to recognize this constraint of the historical data table. And now we will use migration to update the current database with the new historical data table that we have just created. So which means currently our database doesn't have this table and we have just created it in the code. Now we've used migration to move on this code into the database to create the new table. So now we go to Package Manager console and type add migration. This is the command, and then this will be the migration name that you want it to be. It works like a Git. So I'll just like add historical data table and then press enter. It will create a migration like this. I will not run this command because the table has already been there. So I'll just show you what it will be. So it will create a migration file just like this, which has the up method and the down method. So you can roll back if it is needed. So in this one, you can see that for SQL, it will create the table which has the name historical data and has all the columns that we have put into this model. And then it also have the primary key, which is one of the constraints of the table. And also this line, which is automatically generate the ID for the table. And then if we are happy with this migration, we then will run update database. The migration will grab all these comments and put it into the Azure database that we are using. Now we have done the first step to create the historical data table with no items in there. So you will not have all of these. Now we will move to the next step, which is in the application database.cs. We will override the save changes async function, which is used in the update cells in canvas controller.cs file. We will wrap around this save changes async with two methods. One is on before save changes and one is on after save changes. The on before save changes will grab the old values before change and the new values after change, then save them into the historical data table. At this step, we will have some unknown properties for the changing entries, which means we will need the on after save changes method, the second one, to get the final values of the temporary properties and save it into the historical data table. Okay, we'll do it now. Firstly, we'll need to create a historical data entry in the model folder. We'll add a class named historical data entry.cs. So in the file, we have these properties of the new class. This historical data entry will be used in the two methods that I have mentioned. So we will define some similar thing with the historical data. So the historical data entry will contain mainly the key values, the old values, and the new values. And it will put everything else as the temporary properties, which in this one, we will need the second method on after save changes. And then in this class, we also have a method to convert it into the historical data object, which will be stored in the historical data table. So you can see here, we have the table name, date, time, key value, all the properties that historical data table have. And now we move to the application database to override the method save changes async. So the method will be overridden here. As you can see here, I override the save changes async, and this will call two methods, on before save changes and on after save changes. So it has the red underline here because we haven't defined these two methods yet. So now we move to define these two methods in this application database file. So you can see here in the save changes async. Firstly, I will call the method. So what this method will do, it will grab all the old values and new values and save it into the historical data table. It also returns a list of unknown property for the changing entries and store it into the historical data entries variable here. And then we will save the latest data into the current color data. And then the save changes async will be called as normal to update the cell's color. And then after that, I will call the on after save changes. and I'll pass the variable historical data entries here so that it will save everything else of the temporary properties to the historical data table. Okay, now we'll go ahead to define these two methods. First, it will be the on before save changes. We'll create a private method here under the overridden save changes async. And in this method, we'll use the change checker to detect the old values and the new values of the change. So here we have the cases that will be changed. Maybe a new value is created, then we will have the new values property of the historical data entry to be the current value. Or if the value is deleted, so we will have the old values property to be the original value. And also, most of the time in this situation, we'll use the third case, which is when an item is modified, then we will have the old values to be the original one and the new values to be the current one. After that, we'll look through all of the entries and save it into the historical data table. Then we will return a list of entries where the value of some properties are known at this step. And then after that, as you can see here, we'll save the latest information into the color data. So which means the color data value of the item now has been changed. And then we pass the historical data entries, which is this list, to this method so that it will save all other temporary values into the historical data table as well. So we will now move to define this method on after save changes. Here we are. So the on after save changes will take a list of historical data entries. It will be a private function. And here, if the historical data entries is empty, then we just complete the task. Else, we will go through each entry, and if the unknown properties in the temporary properties here is the primary key, so we will assign that value into the key values. And if it's not, then assign all of them into the new values, and then we'll save it into the historical data table. And now we will need to make some endpoints that will be needed for the front end to use. Firstly, we'll create an endpoint to grab all data from historical data table, which we have just built. So in the controllers folder, we will create a controller named historical data controller.cs. And in this controller, as normally, we will have the context, and we will define a get method to get all the historical data items currently in the historical data table. Secondly, we will need an API to get the latest version of Canvas using its ID. So we will go to the Canvas controller and define that get method. Here we are. Our get method will live in the Canvas controller.cs. In this get method, we will have a parameter of ID, and then we will return the canvas with its color data cells using its ID. So we will return only the canvas that has the ID the same as the input ID in the parameter. So if the canvas is null, then we return not found. And finally, we will create an endpoint to get the color cells, which is the color data using its ID. So in folder controllers again, we will create a new controller named color data controller.cs. So in this controller, again, we use the same context, and we have the get method that will return the color data using its ID. So in this way, the front end can grab the information of the color cells to generate the latest version of the canvas. So to sum up, the historical data controller will return the list of everything in the historical data table here, so that the front end will know which one has been changed over the time. The second thing is in the Canvas controller. This API will get the canvas by ID so that after a game session ends, we can grab the correct canvas with all the cells color to display it maybe in a gallery. And the final API endpoints we created is the get method here to get the color data cells by its ID so that we can generate the latest version of the canvas. And now that's done. We will run it to see if everything works fine. So you can see here, when we try to get all the historical data information, it will return us the ID of the transaction, the table name, which is the color data here, the date time of change, the key values, which is the color ID, the old values of the sales color, and the new value of the sales color. Here we can see there are 519 transactions. So now we will try to update a cell to see how it goes. So I will change maybe row 0, column 0 of the latest canvas to a random hex color. Execute. It works fine with code 204. Now we run again, grab all the transactions in the historical data table, and we can see here there is 520 transactions already, which we have just changed it. So everything works fine, and we can test all the methods that we have been created as well. So for the color data, we just input the ID maybe 5 and execute to see how it replies. So it responds with a sales information. So the color data ID, the row, the column, and also the color it currently is. And also we can try to get the canvas by its ID as well. So I'll get maybe canvas number 1. It will respond with the canvas information, the ID, the name, the score maybe, and also it's all the cells belong to the canvas 1. That's cool. Everything is done now. So I hope that you will enjoy this phase 2 of MSA.